throwaway account because my family uses Reddit. Also, if my brother somehow sees this before I'm ready, well, I guess the damage is already done. I honestly don't even know where to start. 3 days ago, I thought I had a solid marriage. Today, I'm sitting alone in a hotel room, staring at airline schedules I no longer need, trying to figure out whether my entire life has been one long joke that everyone understood except me. I'm Ethan Mercer, 38, from Columbus, Ohio. I work as a regional operations manager for a logistics company, which basically means I spend way too much time in airports pretending delayed flights are networking opportunities. My wife, Vanessa, is 36. We've been married for 11 years. Or maybe I should say we were. If you've ever met someone who can lie without blinking, you'll understand what I'm about to describe. Vanessa could tell you the sky was green while standing under a cloudless blue afternoon, and somehow make you question your eyesight. I used to think that confidence was one of the things I admired about her. Now I think she just got a lot of practice. For months, she'd been acting strange. Nothing dramatic enough that you'd immediately think affair. Just little things. Her phone suddenly became surgically attached to her hand. She changed the passcode after 10 years of never bothering with one. If I walked into the room, she'd tilt the screen away. When I asked who kept texting so late, she'd sigh dramatically. "Melissa." 5 minutes later. "Actually, no, it was my cousin." The next day. "Oh, sorry, that was one of the moms from my yoga class." Every answer was different. Every answer came instantly. Every answer was a lie. I just didn't know it yet. Whenever I questioned anything, she'd flip it around on me. "You don't trust me. You're getting paranoid. You've been traveling too much. I can't even have friends anymore." By the end of every conversation, I somehow found myself apologizing. Looking back, it's embarrassing how effective that was. Then there was my younger brother, Ryan. He's 34, single, funny. The kind of guy who can walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 10 new friends. Growing up, everyone loved Ryan. Teachers, neighbors, girls. Even my parents admitted he was the easy child. I never resented him for it. Why would I? He was my little brother. We fished together every summer. He was my best man at my wedding. When Dad died 6 years ago, Ryan was the one who stood beside me through the funeral because I could barely keep it together. I trusted him more than almost anyone. Vanessa always said she thought of Ryan like another brother. Funny how that sentence makes me sick now. The business trip itself was supposed to be routine. Chicago, 3 days, leave Monday morning, home Wednesday night. Vanessa kissed me goodbye at the airport, held my face, told me she'd miss me. Actually pouted because I'd be gone for our weekly movie night. "You owe me one when you get back," she laughed. I told her we'd order takeout from her favorite Thai place. She smiled. "I love you." Those were the last words she said to my face before everything exploded. Or maybe I should say, before I learned she'd been saying the exact same words to me while planning something I couldn't even imagine. At that point, I still believed my biggest problem was surviving another corporate presentation. God, if only that had been true. I keep replaying that business trip because it's incredible how obvious everything seems once you know the ending. The first day in Chicago was completely ordinary. Meetings, client lunches, and another anonymous hotel room. Every few hours, my phone buzzed with messages from Vanessa. She told me she missed me. She sent me a picture of the dinner she'd supposedly made at home. Later, she sent a selfie wearing one of my old hoodies, curled up on the couch with a blanket. At the time, it made me smile. Now I notice things I never saw before. There were 2 wine glasses on the coffee table. One was empty. One wasn't. I never looked past her face. That still bothers me. The next afternoon, my younger brother Ryan called out of nowhere. We weren't the kind of brothers who talked every day, so the call stood out more in hindsight than it did then. What strikes me now is what he wanted to know. He kept asking about my schedule, how long I'd be gone, whether my meetings might end early, whether there was any chance I'd catch an earlier flight home. At the time, I thought he was making conversation. Now I know he was making sure he still had time. That evening, Vanessa called before I went to bed. Nothing she said sounded unusual, but something felt off. She seemed distracted, like part of her attention was somewhere else. Every answer came a little too quickly, as if she'd already prepared it before I asked. She told me she'd had a stressful day at work and was relaxing for the evening. I let it go. Looking back, I think I ignored my instincts because trusting your spouse is supposed to feel normal. Admitting you suspect them means admitting your marriage might already be falling apart. The real turning point came later that night. Around 9, my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, called. She wasn't accusing anyone of anything. She simply thought I should know that Ryan's truck had been parked outside my house for several hours. By itself, that wasn't suspicious. Ryan had stopped by plenty of times over the years. What caught her attention was that I was out of town, and he'd almost never visited Vanessa when I wasn't home. After we hung up, I casually texted Vanessa to mention that Mrs. Callahan had seen Ryan's truck. She replied almost immediately, explaining he'd stopped by to help move some furniture. Then she corrected herself. First, it was one piece of furniture, then another. Then she changed it again. It was a tiny inconsistency, but for the first time in our entire marriage, I caught myself wondering why someone telling the truth would need to keep changing such a simple story. Eventually, I convinced myself I was reading too much into it. I put my phone down. I went to sleep. Looking back now, I think that was the last peaceful night I'd ever have as a married man. The next morning started like every other business trip I'd ever taken. I woke up before my alarm, answered a few emails, grabbed an overpriced coffee from the hotel lobby, and headed to the convention center expecting another full day of meetings. Instead, everything unraveled before 10 in the morning. The client we'd flown out to meet announced that the final presentation had been canceled. A contract issue on their end had pushed the entire project back by several weeks. After a short meeting and a lot of apologetic handshakes, everyone was told they could head home early. Most of my coworkers were thrilled. I was too. An unexpected day at home with my wife sounded a lot better than another night eating room service burgers. I didn't tell Vanessa. That wasn't intentional at first. I figured I'd surprise her. She always complained that my work trip stole time from us, so I imagined walking through the front door that afternoon, seeing her face light up, maybe taking her out for dinner. It's strange how quickly ordinary plans can become impossible. My flight left just after noon. During the layover, Vanessa texted me twice. The first message complained about how exhausted she was after work. The second said she was planning to spend the evening alone with a movie because she missed me. I remember smiling while reading it. Even now, I hate admitting that. By then, she already knew exactly what she planned to do that night. She just didn't know I was coming home. The flight landed a little after 4. I grabbed my suitcase and drove toward our neighborhood. About 15 minutes from the house, I realized I'd forgotten to pick up the dry cleaning I'd promised to bring home before the trip. It wasn't important, but the cleaner was only a few blocks away. I figured I'd be inside for 5 minutes. That tiny detour changed everything. As I pulled into the shopping plaza, I noticed a familiar black pickup parked outside a sporting goods store. Ryan's truck. I slowed down without really thinking about it. There are thousands of black pickups in Ohio, but this one had the same faded tailgate, the same dent above the rear wheel, and the same fishing club decal he'd had for years. I actually smiled. What were the odds? I almost called him. Then I remembered he was supposed to be working across town. Maybe he'd taken the afternoon off. Maybe I was mistaken. I parked, picked up my clothes, and when I came back outside, the truck was gone. I thought nothing of it. I wish I could say some instinct told me to pay attention. It didn't. I was still making excuses for everyone. By the time I reached my neighborhood, it was just after 5. Everything looked completely normal. Kids were riding bicycles. Someone was mowing their lawn. Mrs. Callahan was watering flowers in her front yard. She noticed my truck immediately. The expression on her face changed the moment she recognized me. It wasn't surprise. It was confusion. She actually stopped watering her flowers. I rolled down my window to wave. She walked over slowly. I remember noticing that she kept looking toward my house instead of at me. That's when my stomach tightened for reasons I couldn't explain. She clearly thought I wasn't supposed to be there. Neither, as I would soon discover, did anyone else. I parked in my driveway and shut off the engine. But I didn't get out right away. Mrs. Callahan had reached the edge of my yard before I even opened the truck door. She looked surprised to see me, almost like she'd seen a ghost. She apologized immediately, saying she'd assumed I was still in Chicago. I told her the meetings had wrapped up early and I'd managed to catch an earlier flight. She hesitated. Then she mentioned that Ryan's truck had been at my house again. Not yesterday. Today. According to her, he'd arrived a little after lunch. She hadn't seen him leave. I remember telling myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe something around the house had broken. Maybe Vanessa needed help moving furniture after all. Maybe Ryan had stopped by to borrow one of my tools. There are hundreds of innocent reasons a brother might visit his sister-in-law. The problem wasn't that he'd been there. The problem was that nobody had mentioned it. I thanked Mrs. Callahan, grabbed my suitcase, and walked toward the front door. Everything looked normal. The curtains were closed. My truck wasn't expected home until the next evening, so I wasn't surprised the driveway was empty except for Vanessa's SUV. I unlocked the front door as quietly as I could. Part of me still wanted to surprise her. The house smelled faintly of vanilla candles. The television wasn't on. The kitchen lights were off. It was strangely quiet. I set my suitcase down without making much noise and called out that I was home. Nothing. No footsteps, no excited greeting, no voice from upstairs. That wasn't like Vanessa. Even if she'd been asleep, our dog usually announced anyone walking through the front door before they could take 2 steps inside. That's when another detail hit me. The dog wasn't barking. In fact, I couldn't hear him anywhere. I walked into the kitchen. His food bowl had been moved. His leash was gone from the hook by the garage door. Vanessa had apparently taken him somewhere, or so I assumed. Then I noticed 2 coffee mugs sitting in the sink. One had lipstick on the rim. The other didn't. Again, not proof of anything. Ryan had coffee at our house plenty of times over the years. Friends visited. Neighbors stopped by. Individually, every detail had an innocent explanation. Collectively, they started piling up. I headed upstairs, still expecting Vanessa to appear at any moment laughing because I'd managed to surprise her. Instead, I found our bedroom door closed. That wasn't unusual either, except I could hear something on the other side. Not voices, movement, soft, unclear. Just enough to make me stop walking. For several seconds, I stood perfectly still in the hallway, convincing myself I was imagining things. I even considered knocking on my own bedroom door. Looking back, that thought seems ridiculous. But denial is a powerful thing. When your brain is protecting you from something it isn't ready to accept, it will invent almost any explanation before it accepts the obvious one. I reached for the doorknob. Then I froze. There it was again. A muffled sound, followed by what I was almost certain was a man's laugh. My heart started pounding so hard I could actually feel it in my throat. Even then, even standing outside my own bedroom, I still wasn't prepared for what I was about to see. I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling of standing outside that bedroom. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something colder. My brain was still desperately trying to invent innocent explanations for sounds that, deep down, I already understood. I stood there for what was probably only 5 or 6 seconds. It felt much longer. I remember staring at the brass doorknob we'd picked out together when we remodeled the house 3 years earlier. Vanessa had insisted on replacing every cheap builder-grade fixture because she wanted the house to feel more like us. Funny how memories work. The last happy thing I thought about before my marriage collapsed was a doorknob. I reached out and turned it. The door wasn't locked. It swung inward quietly. For a second, nothing made sense. The room looked almost normal. The curtains were half closed. The television was on with the volume muted. Our comforter was tangled across the bed. Then my eyes adjusted. Ryan was sitting upright on my side of the bed. He wasn't wearing a shirt. Vanessa was beside him. She had pulled the blanket up to her chest so quickly that it barely covered her. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was like time had simply stopped. Ryan looked terrified. Vanessa looked shocked for exactly 1 second. Then, almost unbelievably, her expression changed. Not guilt, not shame, annoyance, as though I had interrupted something important. I couldn't stop looking at my brother. My own brother. The guy who used to sleep in the bunk below mine during family vacations. The guy who stood next to me at my wedding. The guy I'd trusted with my house keys. I kept waiting for him to say something. Anything. To tell me there was some explanation my brain couldn't see. He couldn't even look me in the eyes. Vanessa recovered first. Her face hardened almost immediately. Instead of looking embarrassed, she looked irritated, like this situation was somehow inconvenient for her. That was the moment something inside me changed. Not because I had caught them, because I realized neither of them seemed nearly as surprised as I was. Ryan knew I was supposed to be in Chicago until the next evening. Vanessa knew it too. They hadn't expected me home. They'd expected another full day together. I noticed Ryan's jeans on the floor, his wallet sitting on my nightstand, his truck keys lying next to the framed photograph from our 10th anniversary, the same picture where Vanessa had her arm around me, smiling at the camera like I was the luckiest man alive. I looked around the room slowly. There were 2 glasses of wine on Vanessa's dresser, a pizza box from the Italian place she always claimed was our place. My sweatshirt was draped over the chair. Ryan had apparently been wearing it. That detail hit harder than almost anything else. I don't know why. Maybe because it felt so personal, like they hadn't just betrayed me. They'd made themselves comfortable doing it. My eyes drifted back to Vanessa. She wasn't crying. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't even trying to hide. She simply stared back at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It was the expression of someone who had already decided the truth didn't matter anymore. And somehow, I knew this wasn't the first time. You don't reach that level of comfort by making one terrible decision. You get there after weeks, maybe months, maybe longer. Standing in that doorway, I realized I wasn't witnessing the beginning of an affair. I was witnessing the first time they'd been unlucky enough to get caught. I don't remember how long I stood in that doorway. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute. Time has a strange way of stretching when your entire life falls apart in front of you. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't throwing things. I wasn't even crying. I just stood there looking at the 2 people I trusted most, trying to reconcile them with the strangers sitting on my bed. Ryan still couldn't look at me. His head stayed down, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his shirt. He looked like a man who finally understood that one terrible decision had just destroyed his entire family. Vanessa was different. She wasn't panicked. She was calculating. I watched her mind working almost in real time. She knew she couldn't deny what I'd seen. So instead, she started trying to change what it meant. It happened so quickly that I almost admired how practiced she seemed. Within moments, she had transformed from someone who had been caught cheating into someone who acted as though she was the injured party. Her expression hardened, and I realized something that still makes my skin crawl. She had already prepared for this day. Maybe not the exact circumstances, but she had prepared for being caught. There wasn't confusion in her eyes. There was strategy. She began offering explanations that contradicted each other almost immediately. First, the affair supposedly wasn't what it looked like. Then, it had only happened once. A moment later, it had actually been an emotional relationship that had gotten out of hand. Then, somehow, it became my fault, because I'd been traveling so much for work. Every new version erased the one before it. She didn't seem bothered by the contradictions. She simply moved on to whichever story she thought had the best chance of sticking. I realized I'd seen her do that before. Not with something this enormous, with little things. Forgotten errands, Credit card purchases. Arguments we'd had months earlier. Whenever the facts became uncomfortable, she'd simply replace them with better ones and repeat them until everyone else gave up. I had mistaken that habit for stubbornness. Standing in that bedroom, I finally understood it for what it really was. Ryan eventually tried to say something. I don't even remember what. Whatever it was sounded empty before it left his mouth. There are moments when apologies lose all meaning. This was one of them. I looked around the room again. Everywhere I turned, there was another reminder that this hadn't been spontaneous. There were men's clothes folded neatly over the chair. An extra phone charger plugged into the outlet on Ryan's side of the bed. A half-finished deck of cards on the nightstand. Someone had been comfortable enough to spend hours there. Maybe entire afternoons. This wasn't two people making a reckless mistake. This looked like routine. Like they'd built a second relationship inside my marriage. The realization hit me harder than actually seeing them together. I had interrupted something that already had its own habits, its own rhythm, its own normal. My home had become the place where they played house whenever I left town. That thought settled into my chest like a block of concrete. Vanessa kept talking. The words blurred together. Excuses, justifications, accusations, promises, blame. She seemed convinced that if she kept talking long enough, one version of the story would eventually erase the truth sitting right in front of me. For the first time since we'd met, I didn't believe a single word she said. Not one. And somehow, that hurt even more than the affair itself. I don't remember deciding to leave the bedroom. One moment I was standing there listening to Vanessa try to explain away the impossible, and the next I found myself downstairs in the living room. I needed air. Mostly, I needed to think. I sat staring at the family photos on the mantel. Our honeymoon. Christmas at my mom's house. Summers at the lake. Ryan was in almost every picture. He hadn't been a visitor in my life. He'd always been part of it. That made everything feel contaminated. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps. Ryan came downstairs first. He had gotten dressed, but he still couldn't look me in the eye. He stood near the front door for a moment, as if searching for words that didn't exist. Then he picked up his keys and left. I heard his truck pull away. That was the last time I saw my brother for months. Vanessa stayed upstairs longer. When she finally came down, she'd changed clothes, fixed her hair, and looked almost normal. It was unsettling. If someone had walked in then, they never would have guessed what had happened 20 minutes earlier. She sat across from me and started explaining again. Not apologizing. Explaining. Every version of the story contradicted the one before it. First, she insisted the relationship had only recently become physical. Then she admitted it had been going on longer. Then she claimed they'd been trying to end it. Later, she insisted they hadn't known how to tell me. I stopped trying to follow the timeline. Instead, I asked myself a different question. If she was lying this much after being caught, how much had she lied before? When I wondered how long it had been going on, I never got one answer. Weeks, then months. Then suddenly, it didn't matter. That was when I realized she either couldn't keep track of her own stories, or the truth was far worse than anything she'd admitted. I walked into the kitchen and picked up my phone. Out of instinct, I opened our shared family calendar. Most of my business trips were marked there months in advance. As I scrolled through them, I noticed a pattern. Almost every overnight trip had a note beside it. Self-care day. Movie night. Relax. I remembered teasing Vanessa about always planning little treats for herself whenever I traveled. Now I couldn't stop wondering if those reminders had never been for her at all. Maybe they were for Ryan. Then another memory surfaced. That phone call from Chicago. Ryan hadn't been making conversation. He'd been confirming my schedule, making sure my return flight hadn't changed, making sure they still had time. That realization hurt almost as much as finding them together. It meant they hadn't simply taken advantage of an opportunity. They had planned around my life, around my work, around my trust. My business trips hadn't interrupted their relationship. They'd become part of its routine. and for the first time since I'd come home early, I realized I'd probably uncovered only a fraction of what had really been happening. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Vanessa stayed in the guest room after I told her I didn't want her anywhere near me. I spent hours sitting alone in my office, surrounded by silence that somehow felt louder than any argument. Every few minutes, another memory surfaced. Every memory suddenly had a different meaning. I kept asking myself the same question. How had I missed this? Around 2 in the morning, I opened my laptop. Not because I was looking for a fight, because I needed facts. My emotions were all over the place, but facts don't change. The first thing I checked was our family calendar again, then my own travel schedule. I listed every overnight business trip I'd taken during the previous year. There were 14, enough that I could almost remember each one without looking. Then I opened our home's smart security app. I wasn't expecting much. The cameras only recorded the front driveway and the front porch. Nothing inside the house. Still, if Ryan had been visiting while I was away, there would at least be a record of his truck arriving. Except, there wasn't. Not a single recording. At first, I thought the app was malfunctioning. Then I noticed the settings. Recording had been disabled. Not permanently, only on specific days. I scrolled through the history. Every disabled period matched one of my overnight business trips almost perfectly. Leave Monday morning. Recording disabled Monday afternoon. Recording restored Wednesday evening. Trip after trip. Month after month. Whoever had turned the cameras off hadn't forgotten to switch them on again. They'd done it deliberately. Only while I was gone. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. That wasn't panic. That was planning. I checked another trip. Same thing. Another. Exactly the same. The pattern never broke. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. This hadn't been reckless. It hadn't been spontaneous. It had been organized. The cameras hadn't protected our home. They'd protected their secret. Then another thought hit me. The dog. I'd wondered earlier why he hadn't greeted me at the door. I checked the messages from the local boarding kennel. There it was, an automatic confirmation email. Our golden retriever had been dropped off that morning for overnight boarding, under Vanessa's name. She'd told me she wanted to save money by asking a neighbor to watch him whenever I traveled. Instead, she'd been paying to have him somewhere else. No barking, no surprise, no witness. I stared at the confirmation email for a long time. That single reservation changed everything. People don't board their dog because a brother is stopping by for coffee. They board the dog because they expect privacy, because they expect to be interrupted otherwise. By sunrise, I wasn't wondering whether the affair had been real anymore. I was wondering how many times my own house had been turned into their meeting place. 5, 10, 20. I honestly didn't know. And somehow, not knowing was becoming worse than knowing. By the next afternoon, I had stopped asking myself whether the affair was real. That question had been answered the moment I opened my bedroom door. Now I needed to understand how long my life had been a lie. I called my office and told them I wouldn't be coming in for the rest of the week. I blamed a family emergency. For the first time in years, that wasn't an exaggeration. Vanessa spent most of the morning trying to act as though we could somehow have a normal conversation. She made coffee. She cleaned the kitchen. She folded laundry. Watching her go through ordinary household routines after what I discovered was deeply unsettling. It was like she believed enough normal behavior could erase the previous day. I barely spoke to her. Instead, I stayed in my office with my laptop. Our phone bill was the first place I looked, not because I expected to find romantic text messages. Those had probably been deleted long ago, but phone records tell their own story. Numbers, dates, times. Patterns. I downloaded 6 months of call logs. Ryan's number appeared far more often than I remembered. Almost every conversation happened while I was traveling. Some lasted only a few minutes. Others stretched close to an hour. Very few happened when I was home. That wasn't how brothers and sisters-in-law normally talked. At least, Not in my experience. Then I started comparing those calls with my flight itineraries. Every time I boarded a plane, their communication increased. The day before I returned home, it usually stopped. It was almost mechanical, like someone flipping a switch. I felt sick, not because of the calls themselves, because they fit perfectly with everything else I'd already found. The disabled security cameras, the kennel reservations, Ryan checking whether my schedule had changed. None of those things proved how long the affair had lasted. Together, though, they painted a picture that was becoming impossible to ignore. Then I remembered something else. About 8 months earlier, Vanessa had insisted we replace the garage keypad because she claimed the old one was unreliable. She'd hired someone while I was at work. At the time, I hadn't questioned it. Now I logged into the smart home account connected to the new system. There was an activity log. Every code entered. Every time the garage door opened. Every time it closed. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. My code, Vanessa's code, delivery access. But there was another user. A permanent access code labeled only as guest. I didn't remember creating it. I checked when it had first been added. 9 months earlier. The same month Vanessa had insisted the keypad needed replacing. The activity history made my chest tighten. That guest code had been used repeatedly. Almost never on weekends. Almost never in the evenings. Almost always on weekday afternoons. Almost always while I was hundreds of miles away. I sat there staring at the screen for what felt like forever. I didn't know who had used that code. I couldn't prove it. But I knew. Deep down, I already knew. They hadn't been sneaking through the front door. They'd had their own way into my house. My own home had become somewhere I wasn't expected to return to until the schedule allowed it. That realization broke something inside me. Not because it proved another lie. Because it proved there had been planning, preparation, confidence. People don't build systems around accidents. They build systems around routines, and their routine had been my absence. By the end of that day, I wasn't looking for more proof because I doubted myself. I was looking for proof because I knew, eventually, everyone else would ask for it. My parents, friends, maybe even a lawyer. Nobody wants to believe that a wife could carry on an affair with her husband's own brother for months. Honestly, I didn't want to believe it either. But the evidence kept stacking higher. I saved copies of everything I'd found. The camera logs, the garage access history, the kennel receipts, the phone records. I backed them up in 3 different places. That wasn't because I thought Vanessa would destroy them. It was because I suddenly realized I had no idea what she was capable of anymore. When trust disappears, certainty goes with it. Late that afternoon, my phone rang. It was my mother. I watched it vibrate for several seconds before answering. She sounded cheerful. She asked how the business trip had gone, whether I'd made it home safely, whether Vanessa liked the little souvenir she'd reminded me to bring back. I closed my eyes. For the first time in my life, I couldn't answer one of my mother's questions. I just listened. Eventually, she noticed something was wrong. She asked if I was sick, tired, overworked. I almost told her everything. I almost said the words out loud. Instead, I told her I'd had a rough couple of days and needed some time before talking about it. She accepted that immediately. That's what mothers do. They don't always understand what's happening. They just know something hurts. Before hanging up, she mentioned Ryan. She said she'd been trying to reach him since that morning, but he wasn't answering his phone. That caught my attention. Ryan never ignored our mother, not for an entire day. After the call ended, I checked our family group chat. Nothing from him, no messages, no jokes, no reactions. Just silence. Then I noticed something else. His profile picture had disappeared. A minute later, I searched his social media. Gone. Every account, Facebook, Instagram, even LinkedIn. Either he'd deleted everything, or he'd blocked me. Maybe both. I wasn't angry. Not at that moment. Mostly, I felt exhausted. Running away doesn't erase what happened. It just delays the inevitable. A few hours later, Vanessa knocked softly on my office door. I didn't answer. She left an envelope outside. After I heard her walk away, I picked it up. Inside was a handwritten letter. 6 pages. I read every word. By the end, I realized something remarkable. She had managed to write 6 full pages without taking responsibility for a single decision. According to her version of events, the affair had happened because I worked too much, because Ryan had been there emotionally, because she had felt invisible, because life had become complicated, because feelings were confusing, because no one meant to get hurt, page after page, excuse after excuse. Not once did she simply write that she'd chosen to betray me. Not once did she acknowledge that Ryan had made the same choice. The closest thing to accountability was saying that mistakes had been made. Mistakes. Missing an anniversary is a mistake. Forgetting someone's birthday is a mistake. Building a secret relationship with your husband's brother while he's traveling for work isn't a mistake. It's a decision. Hundreds of decisions, made over and over again. I folded the letter carefully and placed it with the rest of the evidence. Not because it proved the affair, because it proved something else. Even after being caught, she was still lying. Only this time, she was lying to herself. The morning after I read Vanessa's letter, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't waiting for her to explain herself anymore. I was waiting for Ryan. As twisted as it sounds, I felt like I already understood Vanessa. She lied. She manipulated. She rewrote history whenever reality became inconvenient. I'd spent 11 years married to that version of her without recognizing it. Ryan was different. Or at least, I thought he was. I couldn't stop asking myself one question. Why? Out of all the people in the world, why my wife? Why his brother's marriage? Why our home? I stared at my phone for nearly an hour before finally deciding I wasn't going to wait any longer. I sent him a single message. Just 4 words. Call me when you're ready. Nothing else, no insults, no accusations, no threats. At first, there was no response. Hours passed. By lunchtime, I assumed I'd never hear from him again. Then my phone vibrated. One new message. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an explanation. It simply said he was coming over. I almost told him not to. Instead, I waited. About 40 minutes later, his truck pulled into the driveway. Seeing it made my stomach tighten. A week earlier, it had been a familiar sight. Now it looked like evidence. He walked to the front door slowly. He looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept since I'd found them. I let him in. Neither of us said anything for the first minute. We just stood in the living room surrounded by photographs of birthdays, holidays, camping trips, and family reunions. Almost every picture included both of us. The silence became unbearable. Ryan finally admitted that the affair hadn't started the way he'd kept trying to convince himself it had. It hadn't been one terrible decision. It hadn't been one drunken night. It had grown over time. Private conversations, shared complaints. Small boundaries crossed one after another until there weren't any left. Listening to that hurt more than I expected, because it sounded ordinary. There wasn't some dramatic explanation. No grand romance. Just a long series of selfish choices. He admitted that the first time I'd left on a business trip after things became physical, he'd been terrified. He'd expected me to come home unexpectedly, expected neighbors to notice, expected someone to catch them. Eventually, though, nothing happened. Each trip made the next one easier. Each lie became simpler to tell. Each successful deception convinced them they could keep going. Comfort had replaced guilt. Routine had replaced fear. That was probably the hardest sentence I heard all day. Routine. My marriage had become something they scheduled around. Ryan also admitted something I'd already suspected. The phone call he'd made while I was in Chicago hadn't been casual. He'd been checking whether my return flight had changed. When Mrs. Callahan saw his truck that afternoon, he'd assumed she wouldn't think twice about it. After all, he was family. People don't usually question family. Neither had I. By the time he finished talking, I realized I'd stopped seeing the younger brother I'd grown up with. The man sitting across from me looked familiar, but he didn't feel familiar anymore. Trust doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes. Then one day you look at someone you've known your entire life and realize you no longer know them at all. When he finally left, I didn't ask him to stay. I didn't tell him I forgave him. Because I didn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. As I watched his truck disappear down the street, I understood something I'd been avoiding since the day I came home early. My marriage was over, but so was my relationship with my brother. And somehow, that second loss hurt just as much as the first. After Ryan left, the house felt emptier than it ever had. Not quieter. Emptier. There's a difference. Silence eventually fades into the background. An empty house reminds you every few seconds that something important is missing. I walked from room to room without any real purpose. The living room, the kitchen, the backyard. Every space carried memories that suddenly felt borrowed from someone else's life. I kept wondering how many times I'd walked through those same rooms while they carried a secret I knew nothing about. By evening, I realized I couldn't stay there another night. Not because I was afraid, because every object had become evidence. The dining table where we'd celebrated anniversaries. The couch where we'd watched movies together. Even the kitchen where she'd packed lunches for my business trips. None of it felt real anymore. I packed a small overnight bag and booked a room at a hotel across town. Before leaving, I told Vanessa I was going. She didn't try to stop me. Instead, she asked whether I thought we could eventually work through this. That question stayed with me during the entire drive. Not because I was considering it, because I couldn't understand how she believed it was still possible. Maybe she genuinely thought enough time could erase everything. Maybe she'd lied to herself for so long that she couldn't imagine anyone refusing to believe another story. The hotel room was plain. Gray walls, white sheets. A desk facing a parking lot. It should have felt lonely. Instead, it was the first place I'd been in days where I could actually breathe. That night, I opened my phone and began reading through old photographs. Years of birthdays, vacations, family barbecues, Christmas mornings. Ryan appeared in almost every album. Sometimes he was standing beside me. Sometimes beside Vanessa. Until then, those pictures had represented happy memories. Now they felt like clues I'd failed to notice. In one photo from the previous summer, Ryan was looking directly at Vanessa while everyone else faced the camera. I'd never paid attention to that before. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. The problem was that once trust disappears, every memory becomes suspicious. You stop remembering the life you lived. You start investigating it. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. It wasn't Vanessa. It was my mother. She asked if she could come see me the following day. No explanation, no details, just a simple request. I realized Ryan must have finally spoken to her, or perhaps she'd figured out enough on her own. Either way, the truth was beginning to spread beyond the three of us. That was inevitable. Affairs stay secret. Consequences don't. I agreed to meet her for lunch. After we hung up, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. For the first time since I'd come home early from Chicago, I wasn't thinking about catching them. I wasn't thinking about the lies. I wasn't even thinking about Ryan. I was thinking about what came next. Divorce, selling the house, splitting our lives into boxes and paperwork, telling friends, answering questions, learning how to exist without the future I'd spent 11 years building. Somewhere around 3 a.m, I finally admitted something to myself. I wasn't grieving the woman Vanessa had become. I was grieving the woman I thought she'd been. Those aren't the same person. And realizing that was somehow the hardest part of all. The next afternoon, I met my mother at a small diner we'd been going to since I was a kid. She was already there when I arrived. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of her. The moment I saw her face, I knew Ryan had told her at least part of the truth. She looked exhausted. Older, like she'd aged several years in a matter of days. I sat down across from her, and for a while neither of us spoke. Neither of us seemed to know where to begin. Eventually, she admitted that Ryan had come to see her the previous evening. He hadn't spared himself. He'd confessed that he'd betrayed me in the worst way he could imagine. According to her, he'd broken down halfway through trying to explain what had happened. She told me she'd never seen him like that before. I believed her. But strangely, it didn't change anything. Regret doesn't erase betrayal. It just arrives after the damage is already done. She asked me if there was any chance my marriage could survive. I answered honestly. I told her that I didn't see a marriage left to save. Trust had been the foundation of everything Vanessa and I built together. Without it, all that remained was paperwork and memories. Neither of those could hold a relationship together. My mother nodded slowly. She didn't argue. She didn't try to convince me to forgive anyone. Instead, she apologized. At first, I didn't understand why. Then she said something that stayed with me. She told me she felt as though she'd failed both of her sons. Failed to raise one who would never betray his own family. Failed to protect the other from being betrayed by it. I reached across the table and took her hand. None of this was her fault. Parents can teach values. They can't make choices for grown adults. Ryan hadn't become responsible for his decisions because of how he was raised. He was responsible because they were his decisions. The same was true for Vanessa. When lunch ended, my mother hugged me longer than usual. Before leaving, she quietly admitted that the family would never be the same again. She was right. Some things can be repaired. Some can't. This wasn't just a broken marriage. It was a broken family. That evening, I met with a divorce attorney. Walking into that office felt strangely calm. I'd expected anger. Instead, I felt clarity. The attorney asked for dates, assets, financial records, basic information about the marriage. I answered every question without hesitation. Near the end of the meeting, he asked whether I believed reconciliation was possible. I surprised myself by answering immediately. No. There wasn't any uncertainty left. Not because I hated Vanessa, because I no longer recognized the life we'd been living. As I left his office carrying a folder full of legal paperwork, I realized something. The hardest decision had already been made. Not by the lawyer, not by the court. It had been made months earlier. The first time Vanessa and Ryan chose to keep their secret instead of ending it. Everything happening now was simply the consequence finally catching up to those choices. I got into my truck, started the engine, and drove away knowing there was only one chapter left. The marriage was over. All that remained was learning how to build a life after it. The divorce papers arrived a little over 2 weeks later. By then, the shock had worn off. Not the pain. The shock. There's a difference. Shock makes you question reality. Pain accepts reality and lives with it. My attorney called to let me know everything was ready. I drove to his office on a rainy Thursday morning, signed the documents, and watched 11 years of marriage become a stack of legal forms. It was strangely ordinary. No dramatic music, no shouting. Just signatures, initials, and dates. The law has a way of reducing enormous emotional disasters into paperwork. When I left, I didn't feel relieved. I just felt lighter. Not happier. Just lighter. Like I'd finally stopped carrying something that had been crushing me since I opened that bedroom door. Vanessa contacted me several times over the following weeks. Sometimes through text, sometimes through email, sometimes through mutual friends who thought they were helping. Every message followed the same pattern. She missed me. She regretted everything. She wanted another chance. She believed we were meant to be together. Reading those messages was surreal. Not because I doubted she regretted what had happened. I believe she did. But she regretted the consequences. I never got the feeling she truly understood the choices that created them. Trust isn't something you lose in a single afternoon. It disappears one lie at a time. By the time I caught them, there wasn't any trust left to rebuild. Only the illusion of it. Ryan never asked to meet again. He sent one final letter. It wasn't long. No excuses, no blame, no attempt to justify anything. For the first time since all of this began, it felt honest. He admitted that he destroyed the most important relationship in his life because he'd convinced himself he could keep living two different versions of himself. Eventually, those two lives collided. He said he didn't expect forgiveness. He only hoped that one day I'd remember him as the brother he had once been instead of the man he'd become. I folded the letter and put it away. I wasn't ready to answer it. Maybe I never would be. A month after filing for divorce, I drove past the house for the last time. The for sale sign had already gone up in the front yard. Someone was measuring the windows inside. Another family would eventually live there. They'd paint the walls, replace the flooring, make new memories. They'd never know what happened in those rooms, and honestly, that was probably for the best. I sat in my truck for a minute before driving away. I expected sadness. Instead, I felt gratitude, not for what had happened. I'll never be grateful for betrayal. I was grateful that I'd come home early that day, because if I hadn't, I might have spent years living inside a lie that everyone else already knew except me. Sometimes the truth destroys your life. Sometimes it saves what's left of it. I finally understood that those two things can happen at the same time. It's been a little over a year since I walked through my front door a day early and found my wife in our bed with my brother. If you'd asked me that afternoon what my future looked like, I would have told you I didn't have one. I was wrong. It just wasn't the future I'd planned. The divorce was finalized without much drama. There wasn't anything left to argue about. You can't negotiate trust back into existence. Once it's gone, every promise sounds like another lie waiting to happen. The house sold a few months later. Watching strangers carry furniture through what had once been my home was strangely peaceful. It no longer belonged to the life I'd lost. It belonged to someone else's beginning. Mine was somewhere else. I transferred to a different regional office, not because I needed to run away, but because I needed a place where every restaurant, every intersection, and every grocery store didn't remind me of what had happened. Starting over in a new city was lonely at first. Then it became freeing. For the first time in years, every routine belonged only to me. I started traveling for reasons that had nothing to do with work. I picked up old hobbies I'd abandoned during marriage. I spent weekends hiking instead of worrying about conference calls and flight schedules. Slowly, life stopped feeling like something I was surviving. It became something I was living again. People always ask the same question whenever they hear what happened. Did I ever forgive them? The honest answer is, I stopped thinking about forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't a switch. It isn't something you wake up one morning and decide to give another person. It's something that sometimes arrives quietly after you've healed enough that carrying the anger becomes heavier than setting it down. I don't hate Vanessa. I don't hate Ryan. Hate would require them to occupy space in my life they no longer deserve. We haven't spoken since the divorce became final. From what little I've heard through extended family, their relationship didn't survive either. Apparently, once secrecy disappeared, so did whatever they thought they had built together. That wasn't satisfying to hear. It was just sad. They gave up a marriage, a brotherhood, and an entire family for something that couldn't survive ordinary life. Sometimes I wonder whether they realize that. Sometimes I don't. It isn't my job anymore. My relationship with my parents is different now. Not worse, just different. They're still my parents. I'm still their son. But there are empty chairs at family gatherings that never used to be empty. Some holidays happen twice now. Some birthdays happen separately. That's one of the cruelest things about betrayal. It rarely destroys only one relationship. It sends cracks through every relationship connected to it. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that trust isn't lost the day someone gets caught. It's lost long before that. It's lost with every hidden message, every practiced excuse, every choice to protect a lie instead of a person who loves you. Getting caught is just the moment the truth finally arrives. Looking back, I don't think the worst day of my life was the day I opened that bedroom door. The worst day would have been 5 years later if I'd never opened it at all. Living a lie is worse than discovering one. At least the truth gives you the chance to rebuild. The lie never does. So that's my story. If you've made it this far, thanks for listening. If you liked my story, then subscribe to my channel, give it a like, and write in the comments where you watch me from, or whatever you want. Bye-bye.